Welcome back to English BookCast, everybody. Glad to have you all here for another deep dive with us. Hope you are enjoying these journeys we're taking together. If you're liking what you hear, please do share this around. Let's keep building this little community of bookworms and curious minds, right?
Absolutely. The more the merrier. So today we're going somewhere pretty unexpected, I think. We're diving into America Pré Histórica y Hercules. That's Prehistoric America in Hercules. It's by Frei Fidelis, or Peregrino Vidal, as he was also known.
Okay, prehistoric America and Hercules, that's quite the pairing. I mean, it's not something you come across every day. So where do we even begin with this one? How does the author try to connect those two worlds,
Yeah.
those two ideas?
Right, you're right. It's not your typical historical account, that's for sure. The key here is that Frei Fidelis uses a really unique approach. He uses Sumerian philology to try and make sense of these ancient American narratives.
Sumerian philology. Okay, so for those of us who might not be familiar with that, can you just break that down a little bit? What does that actually mean?
Yeah, of course. It basically means he's using the study of the Sumerian language, like looking at the structure, the root words, things like that, to try and understand ancient American myths.
Interesting.
And the idea behind this is that mythology, these ancient myths, they're not just stories, right? He thinks they actually hold hidden historical truths. These truths have been passed down through generations, but they're hidden in symbolism, in this symbolic language.
So it's kind of like a code almost.
Exactly, yeah, like a code. And to crack that code, he thinks you need the right key, and that key is, as he sees it, is Sumerian philology.
Yeah.
He actually brings up Plato, the Greek philosopher, and even refers to parts of the Bible to back up this idea. I mean, think about it. There are lots of stories and myths that people have argued hold deeper truths, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can definitely see how that approach would be really intriguing when you're trying to piece together a history where the traditional written records are so scarce.
Exactly. And that's one of the things the author is really excited about. He sees this potential to shed light on these murky, these really early periods of American history through those linguistic connections, through the connections in these myths.
So it's like finding a new way to read the past, reading it through this lens of Sumerian language and mythology. And where does the Atlantis connection come in?
Oh, right. Yeah, good point. So one of the first big connections the book makes is to the legend of Atlantis,
Yeah.
the lost city, the whole thing.
Right. Yeah.
And the book lays out this idea that there were 13 original settlers of Atlantis. And these settlers, they're the ones who played a major role in peopling the Americas.
13. That's such a specific number. It makes it sound even more like a foundational myth, right?
Right. And what's even more interesting is that he actually connects these 13 settlers, directly connects them to specific figures that Plato mentions in his writings about Atlantis. So he's building this bridge between, this well-known ancient civilization, Atlantis, even if it is still debated, to his interpretation of those really early days of American history.
It's like he's weaving these threads together from different parts of the ancient world.
Exactly. And it doesn't stop there. The book goes on to talk about a very important element in this early American society that he's describing. He focuses on a central temple and its cantors. Now, these cantors, they weren't just singers, okay?
More than just entertainers.
Yeah, yeah. He makes it clear they were way more than that. They were crucial figures. They were responsible for preserving and transmitting culture, religious practices, all the knowledge, everything that was important to this civilization.
Yeah.
They were like a mix of, I don't know, like oral historians, religious leaders, keepers of their cultural flame.
They sound like a vital link in keeping their heritage alive.
Exactly. And he even describes this whole hierarchy among the cantors. So there was a real structure, a system for how they spread their influence and their knowledge. He also traces how they moved geographically, across the Americas. He even talks about specific regions that were associated with what he calls the Black Cult and the Cult of the Serpent.
Ooh, that sounds a little ominous. The Black Cult and the Cult of the Serpent.
Right. It
Yeah.
definitely suggests that there were some ideological or religious divisions, tensions maybe, even in these very early American populations.
So we're starting to see a picture here of a much more complex, a much richer early American society than maybe a lot of us are used to thinking about. But where does Hercules fit into all of this? I mean, we've got temples, we've got cults, now we've got Hercules, the Greek hero.
Right, right. And this is where things get really, really interesting. Because the book is making the case, a pretty bold case, that Hercules, the Hercules we know from Greek myths, was not just a mythical figure. He was actually a real person. And his famous labors, they took place, at least some of them, right here in the Americas.
Whoa, wait. So he's not just saying that the Greeks, like, brought their stories of Hercules to America later on. He's saying Hercules himself was here.
That's exactly what he's saying. And he goes even further than that. He says Hercules was really involved in the dynamics of this prehistoric American society. He was aligned with the temple, and he was fighting against, actively opposing the black cult.
Okay, that's a pretty huge claim. What kind of evidence is there to back that up?
Well, one thing he points to is the fact that you find depictions of Hercules in a lot of different cultures, not just Greek and Roman. You find them in Babylonian myths, and he even claims there are traces of Hercules in some Mexican tradition.
Oh.
Yeah. So his idea is that Hercules, this figure of Hercules, represents this kind of universal archetype, this hero figure whose story, whose deeds, they resonated across different civilizations, and they popped up in their different mythologies in their own ways. So by connecting all these dots, he's arguing that there must have been a real historical Hercules, and that his influence, it actually reached all the way to the Americas.
Okay, that's fascinating. You mentioned the black cult that Hercules was supposedly fighting against. Can you tell us a little bit more about who they were? And the book also talks about other civilizations existing at the same time, right? Like, what was the relationship between these different groups?
Right. The book does talk about how those different groups interacted. It describes a sort of dynamic, a back and forth between those first Atlantean settlers and their descendants, the black cult, and the people connected to the temple. And then later on, you have civilizations like the Toltecs, the Ixmecs, and the Aztecs, and he brings them into the story too, suggesting they have some connection to those earlier groups, and they're caught up in these ongoing conflicts. As for the black cult, they seem to have been a separate group with their own ideology, maybe even a different way of life. Their beliefs and practices were very different from the temple people, but to be honest, the text doesn't really get into the specifics of what their rituals were or what they actually believed.
So there's still a lot of mystery surrounding them.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've got all these different groups, these different players in this prehistoric world, but who was leading them? Who was in charge, especially for those early settlers and the people of the temple? Was there, like, a main leader?
Well, for those first 13 settlers, the ones he calls the repopulators of America, the book names their leader as Jime. And within the temple itself, the main religious authority was the Grand Sacerdote, which means high priest. So you've got a secular leader for the initial migration, and then you've got this key religious leader within the established temple system.
And what about the serpent cult, the one you mentioned earlier? Where do they fit into all of this with the temple and the black cult?
Right, so the serpent cult, they're portrayed as a pretty major force in prehistoric America. They had a lot of influence. And here's something really interesting. The book mentions that various groups who lived in a land that was toda cercada pelo mar, completely surrounded by the sea, that they were part of this serpent cult.
Surrounded by the sea.
Yeah, and he kind of hints that this could be a link to Atlantis or maybe to other island cultures. The relationship between the serpent cult, the temple, and the black cult, it's not always super clear. It's not always spelled out whether they were, like, directly fighting each other or if they were allies. It suggests maybe that it was more complicated than that. Maybe there was some overlap in their beliefs, some cooperation, some conflict. It wasn't just black and white, good versus evil.
Yeah. Human history is rarely that simple, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so just to make sure I'm following all this, we've got these three distinct groups, maybe more, but at least these three with their own beliefs, their own ways of doing things. And the book is putting Hercules firmly on the side of the temple, right?
That's right. He's definitely portrayed as an ally of the temple and a strong opponent of the black cult. And another important thing is that his actions, the things he does, they're usually guided by a central prophet figure. And this prophet, he's connected to the worship of Jehovah, which is Jehovah.
So there's this monotheistic element woven into the story.
Yeah, exactly. And that's really important because it ties Hercules' actions, what he does, to a specific set of religious and moral beliefs. It gives him a framework within this whole interpretation of prehistoric America that the author's laying out.
This prophet figure sounds really interesting. I mean, it seems like he's the mastermind behind a lot of what's happening.
You could definitely say that. He's this key guiding force in the story. He's the one who inspires and directs Hercules and all those people who follow the temple. He's the one pointing the way. And everything he teaches, everything he does, is tied to the worship of Jehovah. So you can see that monotheistic belief at the core of the temple ideology. And their whole mission, it seems, is to establish order, religious and social order, in the face of these opposing forces like the black cult.
So it's this classic battle between good and evil, light and darkness.
In a way, yeah, but it's also about establishing a specific kind of order, a specific way of life guided by this prophet figure and his connection to Jehovah.
And in this prehistoric America, does the book actually say where the capital of Atlantis was? Like, does it give a specific location?
You know what it actually does? It says the capital of Atlantis was Tiro, which is Tyre, a place we know from history. But here's the thing. He goes even further and says that Tiro wasn't just the capital of Atlantis. It was also a really important city in America during this prehistoric period.
Wow. So he's claiming there's a direct connection, a physical connection between Atlantis and ancient America.
That's exactly what he's doing. He's drawing this really bold link between, this legendary civilization, Atlantis, and actual specific places in the ancient Americas.
It's really making me think about how we view history, how we try to connect the dots, how we use different sources like mythology and language to try and understand the past.
Right. And that's what makes this book so interesting, so thought-provoking.
And speaking of different sources, the title of the book mentions the biblical story. So how does America Pré Histórica et Hercules, how does it connect to the Bible?
Well, there are actually quite a few parallels that he draws. For example, he talks about the deluge, the great flood, and he even mentions Noah, in the context of how the world was repopulated after the flood. And more broadly, there's this overarching theme running through the book, this idea of a divine plan unfolding and this constant struggle between good and evil. And in this struggle, Lucifer of the black cult, they're often seen as the main villains, the antagonists in this cosmic drama. So he's taking these elements from Sumerian traditions, from biblical traditions, and weaving them together with his interpretation of prehistoric America. It's really, really unique.
Yeah, it's a really interesting blend of mythology, philology, and historical interpretation. It's definitely not your typical history book.
No, it's not. And that's what makes it so fascinating. It really challenges us to think differently about the past, to consider these alternative perspectives, to be open to these unexpected connections.
Absolutely. America Pré Histórica et Hercules. It gives you a whole new way of looking at history, a whole new lens. And it really makes you wonder how much more we might discover, how much more is hidden just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered.
I think that's a great takeaway. It's a reminder that history is not always straightforward, and sometimes the most unexpected sources can lead to the most intriguing discoveries.
Definitely. So to all our listeners out there, if you're intrigued by this deep dive, by these ideas, we encourage you to seek out America Pré Histórica et Hercules and see what you think. Explore it for yourselves. Dive into those connections, explore those alternative perspectives, and let us know what you find. We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Absolutely. Keep the conversation going.
Now, before we wrap up, we actually had a few really interesting questions come in from some of you, so we thought we'd take a few minutes to address those. One listener asked, given the focus on Sumerian philology, are there any specific Sumerian words or phrases that the author links directly to American indigenous languages or place names?
That's a great question. It's a sharp one. And to be honest, while we didn't really go deep into specific linguistic examples today, the book does actually delve into that. The author looks at potential similarities in the roots of certain words. He looks at how the structures of certain narratives, how they kind of mirror each other. He points out these recurring themes, this symbolic language that shows up in both Sumerian texts and ancient American texts. And his argument is that this points to a shared understanding, something that goes way back in their ancestry. Now, I don't have the book right here in front of me, so I can't give you any word-for-word comparisons off the top of my head, but the main idea is that he's looking for these thematic and structural parallels to prove a deeper connection.
Yeah, it's kind of like a linguistic archaeology, right? Digging through those layers of language to find those hidden connections.
That's a great way to put it.
Another listener was curious about the timeline. They asked, if Hercules is being presented as an actual historical figure who was here in the Americas, does the book try to put him in a specific time period within those prehistoric timelines that we know about?
That's another really good question. And the truth is, the timeline in the book, it can be a little fluid. It's working within this framework that includes the rise and fall of Atlantis and all the migrations and all the societal changes that happened in America after that. So the author is generally placing Hercules' actions within that broader period, the Atlantean and post-Atlantean period. And a lot of what Hercules does is about, establishing order, fighting against these negative influences. But when it comes to really specific dates, it can be hard to pin things down the way we might with, a more traditional history book. That's because he's dealing with these mythological and philological interpretations. He's not relying on strict archaeological dating.
Yeah, yeah, it makes sense. He's piecing together a narrative, a story based on these different kinds of evidence.
Exactly.
Okay, and one last question from our listeners before we go. This one's about the Black Cult. The listener asks, the way the Black Cult is described, it sounds pretty negative. Does the book go into detail about their beliefs and practices in a neutral way, or are they just presented as, the bad guys?
That's a really fair question. It's an important one to consider. To be honest, the Black Cult is mainly portrayed as this force that's opposed to the temple and to those monotheistic ideas that the prophet and Jehovah represent. And while the book does describe some of their practices, how they were different from the temple people, maybe different forms of worship, different societal structures, it does tend to present them as the enemy, as the force that Hercules and the temple followers need to overcome. So you don't really get a totally neutral or detailed look at their beliefs from their own point of view.
Yeah, that makes sense. It sounds like the book is definitely presenting a particular perspective, a particular interpretation of these events.
Absolutely.
Well, these were all fantastic questions, and they really got to the heart of some of the complexities and nuances of this book. So thank you to everyone who sent those in, and to all of you for joining us on this really unique and thought-provoking deep dive.
Yes, thank you all for listening.
If you're interested in exploring more, in digging deeper into these ideas, we encourage you to find America Pré Histórica, Hercules, and give it a read. It's definitely a book that will make you think, make you question, and maybe even make you see history in a whole new light.
Absolutely.
So from all of us here at English BookCast, thanks for listening, and keep those pages turning.